The rain pelted the city streets, turning alleys into rivers. Cars rushed by, their headlights cutting through the dim, gray afternoon among the faceless figures that walked the sidewalks. One stood out, though few would have guessed why. Clad in tattered clothes and worn-out shoes, a man leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his hair tangled and unkempt. He looked like just another drifter, his head bowed, as if crushed under the weight of invisible burdens. But there was a spark in his eyes, hidden beneath the layers of grime. No one knew this man's secret, nor would they have guessed it if they tried. His name was Marcus Wainwright, a millionaire many times over. He had built an empire from the ground up, a testament to hard work and unyielding ambition. Yet, with all his wealth and power, he had lost something far more precious. A doctor's quiet words echoed in his mind. Even now, as he stood in the chaotic shadow of a boarded-up building. "Mr. Wainwright, I'm afraid you'll never have children." The news had shattered Marcus, stripping away any sense of fulfillment his riches might have brought. The family he had envisioned, the legacy he had hoped to build, vanished in an instant. With no heirs and no one to trust among his distant relatives or scheming business partners, he hatched a plan. A desperate, strange plan. Marcus sold his mansion and luxury cars. Disappearing from the public eye, he transformed himself into a beggar, donning ragged clothes and letting his appearance fall into disrepair. It was a meticulous disguise, one that masked every trace of his former life. Armed only with a few crumpled bills and a desire to see true human nature, he set out on a mission to find someone worthy of his fortune, someone with a heart pure enough to help him when they thought they'd gain nothing in return. But the streets were not as he imagined. He saw the worst of humanity, the people who turned away, who pretended he didn't exist, who sneered or shouted at him to get a job. As days turned to weeks, and the autumn chill seeped through his thin jacket, a bitter loneliness set in. His resolve began to waver. It wasn't until one bitterly cold night, as Marcus huddled in a corner by an old brick building, that he met the first person who didn't ignore him. A young woman, no older than 30, crouched down beside him. Her face was pale from the cold, but her smile was warm. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, slipping a small, steaming cup of coffee into his hands. Marcus glanced up, startled. He hadn't seen kindness like this in weeks. I'm fine, thank you," he mumbled, his voice raspy from disuse. She smiled again, her eyes searching his face. "Well, you don't look fine. My name's Emma, by the way. If you need a place to stay, there's a shelter 2 blocks from here. I can walk you there." Marcus hesitated, a flicker of hope kindling in his chest. But he couldn't let his guard down so easily. He studied her, wondering if she had some ulterior motive. Could she be the one he was searching for? Or was she just another passerby, offering a token act of charity? Questions swirled in his mind as he clutched the warm cup between his trembling fingers. As he followed Emma down the street, he felt the first whispers of something he hadn't known in a long time, a faint, fragile sense of hope. Would Emma prove to be the one he had been searching for? Or was this merely the beginning of a much longer journey? The shelter that Emma led Marcus to was a modest, run-down building wedged between a pawn shop and a diner that never seemed to close. Its faded sign, "Seats, Francis Shelter," swung in the wind, creaking like a tired memory. Inside, the air was thick with the mingling scents of disinfectant and old coffee, yet it was warm, a refuge from the bitter wind outside. Marcus stepped into the shelter, his eyes darting to the few scattered souls inside, each face lined with stories of hardship. For a moment, he faltered, the instinct to flee almost overtaking, but Emma's gentle voice anchored. "Hey, it's all right," she said, guiding him to a seat by the heater. She offered a small, tired smile. "You'll be safe here." Marcus nodded, muttering his thanks as he sat down. He watched as Emma moved through the room, greeting the shelter staff by name, helping an older man with a limp to find a spot near the heater, and pouring coffee for a weary mother with a child wrapped in a too thin blanket. She had an easy kindness about it, the kind that required no effort. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself drifting. Lulled by the rare warmth, he could hear Emma's voice, soft and soothing, speaking to another volunteer. Their words blurred into the background, but a phrase caught his attention. "I just wish I could do more for them. It's hard watching people struggle like this and knowing I can only help a little at a time." Curiosity stirred within Marcus. There was a sincerity in Emma's voice that he hadn't heard in a long time, not in the boardrooms, penthouses of his past life. When he woke the next morning, she was still there, setting out small bowls of oatmeal for breakfast. For the next few days, Marcus kept his distance, observing her from the shadows. He saw how she treated everyone the same. No condescension, no pity. She would sit and listen to people's stories, laugh with them, sometimes even cry with them. And each time she left, she'd quietly slip a few dollars into the donation box. By the door, the puzzle pieces slowly began to fall into place. Marcus learned that Emma wasn't well. She worked at a local diner, barely making enough to cover her rent in a cramped apartment. Yet, she still spent her evenings here, offering whatever she could to those who needed it. It baffled Marcus, and it tugged at something deep inside. One evening, as the shelter quieted down, Marcus finally decided to speak to her. He found her sitting on the steps outside, the sky painted with the hues of a setting sun. She looked up as he approached, offering a welcoming smile. "Hey there," she greeted, patting the step beside her. Marcus lowered himself down with a groan, his back aching from nights spent on hard benches. "Thank you for helping me the other night," he began, his voice cautious, guarded. Emma shrugged, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It was nothing, really. I just hate seeing people suffer when I can do something, you know?" "Why do you do it, though?" he asked, frowning. "You don't even know these people," she sighed, staring into the distance. "I guess I know what it's like to be alone, to feel like the world's turned its back on you. A few years ago, I went through a rough patch. Lost my job, my apartment, everything. Ended up on the streets myself for a while. If it hadn't been for a stranger who helped me, I don't know where I'd be now." Marcus felt a pang of understanding. He knew the loneliness she spoke of, the crushing sense of isolation that came when the world seemed indifferent. He shifted on the steps, unsure how much to reveal. "And now you're trying to pay that back?" Emma's smile softened, sadness touching her eyes. "Not just pay it back, pay it forward. There's this quote I heard once. We're all just walking each other home. I guess that's how I see it." Marcus fell silent, the words settling heavily in his mind. He hadn't expected to find such wisdom here, in a simple shelter, from a woman who had nothing but still gave everything she could. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of admiration, even something like hope. Maybe Emma could be the one, but he knew he had to test her further, to see if this kindness ran deeper than a few warm meals and kind words. The weeks passed, and Marcus, settled into a routine at the shelter, he still kept up his ragged disguise, wearing the persona of a down-and-out beggar. Yet, he found himself strangely content, surrounded by the simple routines of survival and the kindness that Emma seemed to radiate. Every night, he saw her extend her hand to those around her, without a hint of expectation. Marcus knew he couldn't just trust appearances. His past had taught him that people often revealed their true colors when tested, when faced with choices that went against their own interests. He needed to push Emma further, to see if her compassion could withstand real temptation. One particularly frigid night, when the cold bit through even the thickest layers, Marcus decided it was time. He approached Emma with a shaky, calculated desperation in his voice. "Emma, I need your help," he whispered, clutching his coat tighter around himself. She looked up from folding blankets, her brow furrowing in concern. "Of course, what's wrong?" Marcus took a breath, as if summoning the courage to continue. "I have a friend. He's in trouble. Owes some dangerous people money. I managed to scrape together a bit, but it's not enough. I know it's a lot to ask, but could you lend me $50? I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I can." He watched her closely, looking for any hesitation, any sign that she might refuse. Emma bit her lip, glancing down at the nearly empty cash register behind the counter. Marcus knew she didn't have much to spare. She had told him as much in passing conversations, but she looked back at him, her expression softening. "Okay," she said finally, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a worn, thin wallet. She counted out 2 20s and a 10, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the money into his palm. "I don't have more than this right now, but I hope it helps. Just be careful, okay?" Marcus nodded, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief as he pocketed the money. "Thank you, Emma. I'll pay you back, I swear." She gave him a weary smile, the shadows of exhaustion lining her face. "You don't have to. I just hope your friend is okay." As Marcus walked away, he couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest. It was a small sum to him, less than the cost of a meal in the light he'd once lived, but he knew it meant far more to her. The sacrifice wasn't just in the money, it was in the trust, the unspoken belief that he was worth helping. That night, Marcus found himself alone on a bench beneath a flickering streetlight, the cold seeping into his bones. He pulled out the money Emma had given him and stared at it, lost in thought. He could feel a shift inside him, a crack in the armor of cynicism he'd worn for so long, but he still needed to be sure. He had to see if Emma's kindness was truly as selfless as it seemed, or if she would falter when faced with a real test. A few days later, he returned to the shelter, this time with a story designed to push her even further. He approached her with a wild, desperate look in his eyes, one that made her immediately put down the cans she was sorting. "Marcus, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I've got to get out of town," he lied, wringing his hands. "Those people, They're looking for me now. I need bus fare to get to a place where they won't find me. Please, Emma. I'm begging you." Emma's face paled, and for a moment, Marcus saw the conflict in her eyes. She glanced around the shelter, at the dwindling supplies they were barely managing to stretch, and then back at him. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. This time, he thought, surely she'll say no. She'll protect herself and those she already helps here. But then, she surprised him once more. I don't have much left, but I'll figure it out," she said softly, swallowing hard. "I'll ask around. See if we can gather enough to get you a bus ticket, but please, don't do anything risky until then." Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he listened. He had expected many things from this little experiment. Anger, rejection, even pity. But he hadn't anticipated this level of selflessness. She was willing to jeopardize the little stability she had, all for the sake of someone she barely knew. He left the shelter that night with the truth weighing heavily on his chest, the burden of the lie growing unbearable. As he wandered the darkened streets, he wrestled with the realization that Emma was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her kindness was not a mask, but something true, something that ran as deep as the roots of an ancient oak. The night sky was black as pitch, clouds masking the stars above the city. Marcus lay awake on a thin mattress in the shelter's corner, his mind a storm of thoughts. He knew it was time to reveal the truth to Emma, to let her know who he really was and why he had come to. But the thought of facing her reaction, of seeing the betrayal in her eyes, made his chest tighten with a feeling he hadn't known in years. Fear. The next morning, Marcus waited until the shelter was nearly empty. The few remaining residents shuffling out into the cold for their daily routines. Emma was busy stacking boxes of canned food when he approached her, his hands trembling despite his best efforts to steady them. "Emma," he began, his voice rough and uncertain. She glanced up, offering him that same tired, warm smile that had become so familiar. "There's something I need to tell you. It's important." She set down the box and wiped her hands on her jeans, looking at him with a touch of curiosity. "What is it, Marcus? You look like you've seen a ghost." He took a deep breath, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "I haven't been honest with you about who I am, about why I came here." Her smile faltered, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, weathered photograph, a relic from his past life. It was a picture of him standing in front of his old mansion, dressed in a tailored suit, the sun glinting off the polished marble steps. He handed it to her, watching as her eyes widened in recognition. "I'm not just some homeless man," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Marcus Wainwright. I was a millionaire. I had everything, houses, cars, money, but none of it mattered when I found out I couldn't have a family. I didn't know who to trust, who to leave it all to. So I gave it up and came here, looking for someone who might be worthy." Emma stared at the photograph, then at Marcus, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally to something much colder. "You mean to tell me this whole time you've been pretending, testing me?" Marcus winced at the sharpness in her voice, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "I didn't know how else to find someone who would truly deserve the money, so I disguised myself, put myself out here to see who would show kindness without expecting anything in return." The silence that followed stretched like a chasm between them, and Marcus felt himself sinking into its depths. Emma's face twisted with a mix of anger and hurt. She took a step back, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. "You think this is some kind of game?" she snapped, her voice trembling. "You used me, Marcus. You lied to me. Do you have any idea how many people out there are suffering, genuinely struggling, while you played out your little experiment?" Marcus flinched, feeling the weight of her words cut deep. He reached out, desperate, trying to make her understand. "It wasn't a game, Emma. I was trying to find someone who cared, who could do good with what I have. I wanted to make sure that—" "Make sure of what?" she interrupted, her eyes blazing. "That I'd jump through hoops for you. That I'd give away what little I have just to prove myself." Tears shimmered in her eyes, and she quickly turned away, running a hand through her tangled hair. Marcus could hear the unsteady breaths she took, a tremor in her shoulders. It was then that he realized how deeply he had wounded her, how much his actions had betrayed the trust she had given him so freely. I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I just thought—" Emma turned back to face him, her expression hardening into a mask of resolve. "You thought you could just waltz back into your rich life and throw money at someone, expecting them to thank you for it? Well, Marcus, I don't want your money, and I don't want anything to do with it." The word struck him like a physical blow, and he stumbled back, feeling as if the ground beneath him was slipping away. He had prepared for many outcomes, for people to ignore him, for them to take advantage of his supposed vulnerability. But he hadn't prepared for this, for the realization that he had not only failed his own test, but that he had also lost something precious along the way. As Emma turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the echoing emptiness of the shelter, Marcus felt the weight of his mistakes settle heavily on his shoulders. He had come here searching for someone worthy, but now he couldn't help but wonder, was it he who needed to prove himself worthy all along? And had he lost his chance forever? Days turned into weeks, and Marcus found himself drifting through the city's streets with no real purpose. He tried returning to the shelter a few times, but each time, Emma would either leave as soon as she saw him or ask one of the other volunteers to send him away. Her rejection stung deeper than any words she had thrown at, leaving an emptiness that gnawed at his chest. Marcus no longer cared about his disguise. He wandered aimlessly, his mind lost in the echo of their last conversation. He couldn't bring himself to return to the life he had left behind. The mansion, the wealth, the sterile halls filled with expensive but meaningless things. He couldn't bear the thought of retreating to that isolation again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in a hazy, golden glow, Marcus found himself standing outside the shelter once more. Through the windows, he saw Emma inside, stacking canned goods and talking to a few of the residents. Her face still bore the same lines of exhaustion, but she carried on, her determination unyielding. Watching her, a realization struck Marcus like a sudden, painful truth. He had been so consumed with finding someone who was worthy of his wealth that he had forgotten what it meant to truly care about others, to give without expecting anything in return. He had failed to see that Emma's value wasn't in her potential as a recipient of his inheritance, but in the simple, genuine compassion she showed every day. With a deep breath, he steeled himself and walked inside. The other volunteers cast wary glances in his direction, but no one stopped him. He approached Emma, who straightened when she saw him, her eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked, her voice tired but edged with frustration. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice softer than it had ever been. "I know I hurt. I was wrong. I thought I was testing, but I was the one who failed." Emma crossed her arms, her expression unreadable, but she didn't turn away this time. "And what does that mean, Marcus? What do you expect me to say?" He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I want to help, not with money. I want to volunteer here like you do. I want to try to do something real for a change." She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of deceit or hidden motives. Finally, she let out a sigh, rubbing her temples. "Marcus, this place is for people who are trying to find a way back, people who are struggling just to get by. It's not some place for you to redeem yourself or make up for your mistakes." "I know," he replied, with desperation creeping into his voice. "I know that, but I have to start somewhere. I have to change. You showed me that." For a moment, silence hung between. Emma seemed to wrestle with something inside herself. Her jaw tightened. Then, with a weary shake of her head, she relented. "Fine, but if you're serious about this, you have to work. No shortcuts, no special treatment. You'll be just another volunteer like anyone else." Relief washed over Marcus, and he nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you, Emma. I promise I won't let you down." She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "We'll see, Marcus. We'll see." Weeks passed, and Marcus threw himself into the work at the shelter. He scrubbed floors, sorted donations, and served meals to people who now seemed less like strangers and more like the reflection of a world he had never truly seen before. The tasks were simple, but they carried a weight of meaning that his previous life had lacked. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, of connection to something beyond his own ambitions. Emma remained distant at first, watching him from the corner of her eye, but slowly, the wall she had built around herself began to soften. She saw the way Marcus interacted with the others, how he listened to their stories without judgment, how he shared the work without complaint. He never mentioned his wealth, nor did he try to win back her approval with grand gestures. One cold evening, as they sat together in the empty shelter, Emma finally spoke to him, without the edge that had lingered between them for so long. "Why are you really doing this, Marcus?" she asked, quiet, her voice carrying the weight of genuine curiosity. "You could go back to your life any time, so why stay?" Marcus paused, the question cutting deeper than he had expected. He thought back to the life he had led before, the polished floors and lonely rooms, the business deals that had once seemed so important. I realized that money can't make up for a life without meaning," he said slowly. "I thought I had everything. I was empty. Inside here, doing this, I feel like I'm finally a part of something that matters." Emma studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she nodded. a small, almost reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Well, you've got a long way to go, but maybe you're starting to get it. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the heater filling the space between them. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the cold lift, replaced by a warmth that came not from money or comfort, but from the simple act of being seen, of being understood. Marcus knew there was still one more decision he had to make, one that would determine the future of everything he had left behind. Would he choose to leave his wealth behind entirely, or could he find a way to use it for something greater than himself? As winter deepened, the city's streets grew harsher, the cold cutting through even the thickest layers, but inside the shelter, a sense of community persisted, fueled by small acts of kindness and the unspoken understanding shared among those who had little but offered what they could. Marcus had found a rhythm in this new life, each day marked by tasks that once would have seemed menial but now felt meaningful. Emma began to trust him again, though a trace of the old hurt still lingered in her eyes when she looked at him too long. They worked side by side, their conversations no longer strained, but not quite easy either. Marcus could feel the distance between them shrink, yet he knew that a part of her still held back, uncertain if his transformation was genuine or just another performance. One evening, as a snowstorm battered the city, the shelter reached its capacity. People huddled together on makeshift beds. Grateful for the warmth inside, Marcus and Emma stayed late into the night, handing out blankets and bowls of soup to those who arrived with frostbitten hands and weary eyes. When the last of the newcomers settled down, Marcus turned to Emma, his face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "I want to use my money, what's left of it, to help the shelter. We could expand, take in more people, improve the facilities, but I need your help to do it right." Emma froze, a wary look crossing her face. She set down the ladle she had been holding and crossed her arms. "Marcus, you know how I feel about this. Money can't fix everything." "I know," he replied quickly, his voice earnest, "but it can give us a chance to do more good. I don't want it to be about me, about proving something. I want it to be about the people here, about making sure they have a place to come to, even when I'm gone." She studied him, searching for any sign of the old arrogance, the self-interest that had driven him before. But all she saw was a man who had changed, who had given up comfort and privilege in search of something real. She let out a long breath, her expression softening. "You really mean that, don't you?" Marcus nodded. "I do. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, something in your name. You've done so much for so many people, Emma, and I want to honor that if you'll let me." Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she seemed to lose her footing. She glanced around the shelter, at the worn walls and the people who slept under its roof. "You'd put my name on it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why?" "Because this place is a reflection of you," Marcus said, his voice quiet but steady. "Your kindness, your strength, you've taught me more than I ever learned. In boardrooms or charity galas, I want people to see that." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the muffled sound of the wind outside. Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she blinked them back quickly, her voice trembled. "You don't have to do that, Marcus, but I think it means a lot." She turned away, busying herself with the empty soup pots. But Marcus could see the way her shoulders relaxed, the way a hint of a smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had seen her look at him without the weight of the past between them. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began to put his plan into action. He met with lawyers and financial advisors, but this time, Emma was by his side. She made sure that every dollar would go to those who needed it most, that the shelter would remain a place of dignity and compassion, not just a vanity project for a repentant millionaire. Together, they transformed the shelter into something more, a center for hope, where people could find not just a bed for the night, but job training, counseling, and a path back to stability. The transition was not without challenges. Some of the residents and volunteers were suspicious of the changes, wary of the new funding and the polished renovations that gradually replaced the shelter's old, familiar charm. But as the improvements took hold, they began to see the impact. More space, better resources, a future that no longer felt as uncertain. Through it all, Marcus and Emma's relationship deepened, forged in the long nights of planning and the quiet moments of shared laughter. Marcus found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the way Emma's eyes would light up when they talked about their dreams for the shelter's future. Yet, even as things seemed to fall into place, Marcus couldn't shake a lingering fear. He had found a purpose, a new life that was worth living. But he knew that everything he had built with Emma rested on a fragile foundation. The memory of his deception, the lies he had told when they first met, still hung between them like an unhealed wound. One cold afternoon, as they stood in the newly refurbished kitchen, Marcus took a deep breath, summoning the courage he had lacked before. "Emma, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice unsteady. "Do you think you could ever forgive me for everything I did when I first came here?" Emma looked at him, her expression softening into something that resembled forgiveness, but also sadness. She was silent for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Marcus, I can see that you've changed, and I'm grateful for everything you've done. But trust is a hard thing to rebuild. I think maybe with time I could forgive you, but it'll take time." Marcus nodded, accepting the uncertainty in her words, even as hope flickered in his chest. He knew that some things couldn't be rushed, that the best things often took time to grow. But as he looked around the shelter, the place that had become a home in a way his mansion never had, he felt a sense of peace, a belief that he was finally on the right path, and maybe, just maybe, that path would lead not only to redemption, but to the chance at a new beginning with the person he had come to care for more than he had ever imagined. As the seasons shifted, the shelter's transformation continued, becoming a beacon of hope for those who had once walked the streets without a place to turn. Marcus threw himself into the work, each day bringing new challenges, but also new rewards. The center that had once been a simple shelter was now thriving, providing meals, warm beds, and, most importantly, opportunities for people to rebuild their lives. Emma's presence remained a steadying force, guiding the shelter's evolution with a quiet grace that Marcus admired more each day. Her trust in him was still fragile, like glass that could crack with the slightest pressure, but it was there, growing slowly as she saw the consistency of his dedication. One late spring afternoon, Marcus stood outside the shelter, watching as a group of kids played. In the courtyard, a space they had recently transformed into a community garden, the laughter of children filled the air, and for a moment, he felt a deep contentment settle within him, a warmth that had been absent for so many years. Emma joined him, leaning against the doorframe, a small smile playing on her lips as she watched the children. "You've made a real difference here, Marcus," she said, her tone lighter than it had been in months. "You should be proud of what you've done." Marcus glanced at her, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been the heart of this place, Emma." She shook her head, but her cheeks flushed with a hint of color. "Maybe, but it was your idea to expand, to make it into more than just a shelter. I wouldn't have dared to dream that big." Marcus hesitated, the words he had been holding back for so long finally pressing against his lips. "I never told you this, but I think meeting you saved me before I came here. I didn't see a point to any of it. I thought money was all I had, but it wasn't enough. You showed me what it means to truly care about something." Emma's eyes softened, but there was a sadness there too, an unspoken acknowledgement of the distance that still lingered between them. "I think you saved yourself, Marcus," she replied gently, "but I'm glad I could be a part of it." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the children chase each other through the garden, the sun casting long shadows over the blooming flowers. But then, Emma turned to him, her expression turning serious. "Marcus, I've been thinking, maybe it's time you told the others the truth." He stiffened, the fear he had tried to bury resurfacing. "You think they'll forgive me?" Emma looked at him with a steady gaze. "I think they deserve to know who's been helping them, and maybe, once they understand why you did what you did, they'll see the man you've become." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He knew she was right, that he couldn't keep hiding behind the version of himself he had created. The people he had come to care for deserved honesty, even if it risked undoing everything he had worked so hard to build. He took a deep breath, the decision settling in his chest like a weight he was finally ready to carry. A week later, Marcus stood in the center of the shelter's gathering hall, his hands shaking slightly as he faced the small crowd that had come to know him as just another volunteer. Emma stood beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet the curious gazes directed at him. I have something I need to confess," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "When I first came here, I wasn't honest about who I was. I told you all I was just another homeless man, but that wasn't true. My real name is Marcus Wainwright, and I used to be a millionaire." A murmur rippled through the crowd, faces shifting from confusion to disbelief. Marcus took a deep breath and continued, pushing through the knot of anxiety in his chest. "I lost my way. I thought that money was the only thing that mattered. But when I found out I couldn't have a family, I realized how empty my life really was. I gave it all up, hoping to find someone who would show me what it means to live for something more." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Some looked angry, others hurt, but a few seemed to be listening, weighing his words. He forced himself to keep going, driven by the need to make them understand. I came here disguised, trying to find someone worthy of my fortune, but in the end, it wasn't about the money, it was about finding a purpose, about becoming someone worthy of your trust. I'm sorry for the lies I told, and I understand if you can't forgive me, but I hope you'll let me keep helping, to keep being a part of this place. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and uncertain. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing with the fear that he had destroyed everything he had built. But then a voice broke through the quiet. It was an older woman named Grace, who had been living at the shelter for nearly a year. "You did lie to us, Marcus," she said, her voice rough but steady. "But you also put in the work. I saw how you helped fix the roof when it was leaking, how you sat up all night with Johnny when he was sick. That's gotta count for something." A murmur of agreement followed her words, and Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. With the sting of guilt, he looked at Emma, who gave him a small, encouraging nod, and then back at the crowd. One by one, the residents began to speak, some voicing their anger, others sharing moments where they had seen the truth of Marcus's character shine through the lies. The process was painful, but by the end, the room felt lighter, the tension giving way to a tentative sense of acceptance. That night, as the shelter quieted and the last of the residents found their way to bed, Marcus stood outside, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. Emma joined him, slipping a warm cup of tea into his hands. They stood side by side in the quiet, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "You did well today," Emma said softly, her tone carrying a hint of pride. Marcus smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through his chest. "Thank you, Emma, for everything." She met his gaze, a softness in her expression that he had rarely seen. "You've come a long way, Marcus. Maybe we both have." For the first time, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle within him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there were still challenges to face and trust to rebuild. But as he stood there, beside the woman who had changed his life, he realized that he had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. He had found a place where he truly belonged. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest legacy he could leave behind. Summer arrived, bringing warmth and life to the city that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming to Marcus. The community garden flourished, filled with vibrant flowers and rows of vegetables that the shelter residents tended with care. The garden became a symbol of the new life that had taken root at the shelter, a place where hope and second chances could grow. Marcus spent his days side by side with Emma and the other volunteers, the once strained relationships mending slowly like a wound that healed from the inside out. He found himself smiling more often, laughing with the residents, sharing stories over meals. The man who had once measured success in dollars and acquisitions now found joy in the simplest moments. A shared meal, a quiet evening on the shelter steps, the sight of a child's face lighting up when they picked the first ripe tomato. The foundation they had created in Emma's name was thriving too, drawing support from donors who were moved by the story of the shelter's transformation. But Marcus kept a promise to himself. He never sought the spotlight, never used the foundation as a way to redeem his public image. Instead, he let Emma be the face of their efforts, knowing that her genuine compassion was the heart of everything they did. One warm evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Marcus and Emma sat on the shelter's steps, watching the last rays of light stretch across the city. The air was filled with the hum of crickets and the distant laughter of children playing in the park down the street. "I never thought I'd be here, you know," Marcus said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "A year ago, I thought I'd be back in my old life by now. But this place, it's become home." Emma looked at him, a soft smile touching her lips. "It's funny how life changes, isn't it? I thought I'd always be struggling, that I'd never be able to do more than just get by. But now we're building something that matters." He turned to her, a question lingering in his eyes, one that he had been afraid to ask for a long time. Do you think we could ever move past what happened between us? That maybe someday you could forgive me completely?" She met his gaze, her expression thoughtful, searching his face for the sincerity she had come to recognize. "I think I already have, Marcus," she said softly. "It's just taken me a while to realize it. Trust is something that grows, little by little, like those plants out there." He followed her gaze to the garden, feeling a swell of emotion rise in his chest. "I'd like to keep building that trust, Emma, with you, with everyone here." She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that spoke of new beginnings. "I think that's something we can do together." They sat in silence for a while, the evening settling around them like a comforting blanket. Marcus felt a sense of peace, the kind that came from knowing he had finally found his place, not in a mansion or a high-rise office, but here, among people who had seen him at his worst and helped him become better. As the months passed, the shelter continued to thrive, expanding into new programs and reaching even more people in need. The residents came and went, each bringing their own stories, each leaving a mark on the place that had become a sanctuary for so many. Marcus and Emma grew closer too, their bond evolving into something deeper, built on the shared history of their struggles and the hope they had found in each other. They didn't rush things, letting the connection between them unfold naturally like a flower, blooming in its own time. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus stood outside the shelter, watching as the new sign was unveiled. It read, "The Wainwright Emma Center for Hope," a tribute to both the man he had once been and the woman who had shown him the path to a better life. Emma stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and he felt a surge of gratitude for everything they had built together as the crowd gathered to celebrate the opening of the center's new wing, a space dedicated to job training and education. Marcus looked out at the faces around him, many of them familiar, all of them hopeful. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and smiled. For the first time in his life, he felt whole. He had found a way to turn his wealth into something meaningful, to transform a legacy of isolation into one of hope. And he had found people to share it with, people who had taught him that the greatest gift was not money or power, but the chance to be part of something greater than oneself. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus caught Emma's eye. She stepped closer, slipping her hand into his, a simple gesture that carried the weight of all they had been through together. "You did good, Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made his heart sweet. "We both did." He squeezed her, feeling the truth of her words resonate deep within. "Yeah, we did, and I think there's a lot more good still to come." They stood there together, watching as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting the center in golden light. And as they looked out at the future they had built, hand in hand, Marcus knew that he had finally found a life worth living, one filled with purpose, with love, and with the promise of new beginnings. Because in the end, it wasn't the wealth he had to give that mattered. It was the life he had chosen to live.